Hello and welcome back to the Gate 102 podcast. I hope I find you well and a very happy new year to you all. Hopefully you all had a good Christmas, and if you did make any new year resolutions, hopefully you're doing better than I am. So yeah, good to be back. Obviously first of many this year. And today's an episode that I've been looking forward to do for quite a while. Those who listened to my latest episode, the Sam Allardyce one, that's still available on wherever you get your podcasts. But you may remember at the end of that episode, I said that I'd dedicate an episode where I'd be talking about the squad that Gareth selected for the 2018 World Cup. And I thought, that's what's coming up today, so I thought it'd be a good time to do it. I'll give my thoughts on the squad that was picked. And it's hard because obviously we all know the outcome of the tournament. Therefore, it's easy for me to say what I thought was good and bad about the squad because we know what happened. We know who played well and who didn't. But I'll try and retrap my memory and try and think what I thought at the time of the announcement. I think it'd be sensible to do an episode like this because over the next few weeks, I'll be talking about a lot of some of these players and who were selected across the World Cup games. So I think it would make sense to start with if we just read out the squad that was picked for the 2018 World Cup. So goalkeepers were Jordan Pickford, Jack Butland and Nick Pope. Defenders were Kieran Trippier, Trent Alexander-Arnold and Kyle Walker, Phil Jones, John Stones, Gary Cahill, Harry Maguire, Danny Rose and Ashley Young. Midfielders, Eric Dyer, Jordan Henderson, Ruben Loftus-Cheek, Fabian Delph, Dele Alli and Jesse Lingard. And in the attack, Harry Kane, Jamie Vardy, Raheem Sterling, Marcus Rashford and Danny Welbeck. So there you have it. I mean, it goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway. It's clear that Southgate would have thought deeply about who he was going to pick and, it wouldn't have been a quick decision. I'd imagine he kept making drafts of the squad throughout the build-up to the summer. But I was about 10 years old at the time of this announcement, so my memories aren't very clear, but I seem to remember there being lots of debate whether Joe Hart was going to make the squad. And despite the constant speculation, in the end, Hart didn't make the cut. And this was mainly down to the decline at club level. Obviously, he fell out the radar at Man City and, was Burnley's backup and just didn't make the cut. And this was mainly down also the emergence of younger goalkeepers. Pickford had won Everton's Player of the Year, a really impressive season. He'd done well for England in his 2 games as well. Nick Pope, who was selected, helped Burnley finish 7th in the Prem. Butland was a player Southgate knew quite well, so it just meant there was no room for Hart really. And I think I wasn't too surprised, to be honest, at the time. But I think the only argument for Joe Hart going was the experience he had. But sometimes inexperienced players can be the best outcome, and this is definitely the case this tournament. So moving on to the defence, Gareth picked players like Trippier, Maguire and Trent Alexander-Arnold, and when the squad was announced, they probably didn't even have 10 caps between them. But the great thing was, alongside these young, inexperienced players, you had some of the older heads in Phil Jones, Gary Cahill and Ashley Young. And I thought this balance of inexperience and experience worked well. And while Southgate was never afraid to throw a young player in, he also picked a few players who were there almost as backups and to provide support. Obviously, Walker and Stones were also selected, and that came to no surprise, really. Obviously, the pair were pivotal in helping Man City win the Premier League title. But one thing that did surprise me, and I remember thinking this at the time, was the lack of left-footers in the team. Not just in the defence, but in the team as a whole. So if we exclude the goalkeepers, out of 20 outfield players, only 2 of them were left-footed. Yep, only 2. They were Danny Rose and Fabian Delph. Obviously, Pickford was also left-footed, but being a goalkeeper, it's irrelevant, to be honest. But in fairness, it worked out well as players like Young and Maguire played in the left side of defence and both right-footed players, and both adapted really well. In terms of the midfield, I think that was the strong point, in my opinion. We had Eric Dyer, who was a great player at the time, as well as Jordan Henderson. I always said Henderson was a player who would sweat blood for the country. Big fan of Henderson. I mentioned Delph before. He also played a part in City winning the league. Moving on to the more attacking midfield, we had Lingard, Dele Alli, two players who Southgate really rated and both had brilliant seasons. And also Ruben Loftus-Cheek, who was a great young prospect at the time. So the midfield stood out as being really talented for me, and that's, I think, the most creative area we had. The only concern I had with the midfield was the lack of players who could play that sort of deep pivot holding midfield role. Eric Dyer was listed as a midfielder, and that was because of England's lack of options there, really. But I always saw him as a centre-half. It was Henderson who played that so-called number 6 role, which wasn't really his game. I saw him more as a box-to-box player at the time. But yeah, Henderson filled in there really well. And I suppose it wasn't until Declan Rice came along until we had that natural defensive midfielder. But in terms of the attack, it obviously came to no surprise that Harry Kane was picked and was named captain at 24 years old. And I think this was a decision that worked well, but I think a few expected that Henderson would wear the armband, as he was captain throughout the qualification campaign and was also Liverpool captain. But it was given to Kane, and yeah, right decision, and obviously still captain now at the time of recording this episode. Jamie Vardy, Raheem Sterling and Marcus Rashford were all selected. And I think something these players all have in common was that they were very fast and could run in behind. And I think this showed that Southgate was almost building his team around Kane. As we know, Kane always likes to drop deep and to have fast, prolific forwards running in behind. And those three players could all do that. And that's why I think, obviously I'll go into the games in more detail over the next few weeks, but I think the one thing Southgate got spot on this tournament was he'd always have loads of runners running beyond Kane. And yeah, worked really well. Danny Welbeck was also selected as that sort of fifth attacking player. He'd been injured for the majority of the season, but came back around February, finished the season really strongly with Arsenal. I seem to remember some people being surprised Welbeck was in the squad, but you could sort of understand it as he was in form, always did a decent job for England, and was one of few players with a bit of experience. So, yeah, quite probably the right decision to include Welbeck, even though he obviously didn't play much of a part in the tournament. But I think we can all agree that when you hear some of the names I've read out, the talent in the squad that we had at the time is nowhere near the level of other nations in that tournament, such as France, Belgium, Brazil, Spain, Argentina. We all know the countries I'm on about. But the squad Southgate picked did excite me, as it had lots of young players who had great seasons for the club, as well as those experienced ones. I think the most noticeable thing was that the squad had great character and heart and a sort of a fearless attitude. I think that's what made England such a success, that tournament. So that's that really. Obviously, it's strange doing that because I'm reacting to a squad for a tournament that was picked 7 years ago and that I know the outcome of, but hopefully you've enjoyed that. So next week, I'll be talking about England's World Cup warm-up game at Wembley, which is a 2-1 win against Nigeria. The episode after that will be about the second warm-up game against Costa Rica. And then finally, I can talk about the Tunisia game and we can start talking about the 2018 World Cup. And yeah, I can't wait for that. I must also mention, it was announced last week that the main man, Gareth Southgate, had received a knighthood and is now Sir Gareth Southgate. I just realised I've not called him that yet this episode. Maybe start to get used to that, but I'm not going to do an episode giving my thoughts on the knighthood, and that's because I was very fortunate to be on the Free Lions podcast once again, where I spoke to Russell and gave my thoughts on the knighthood. So do give that a listen if you want. You can find it wherever you get your podcasts from. And yeah, do check out Free Lions podcasts. I'm sure many of you listen to it as well as this. Right, that just leaves me to say thanks for listening. Always appreciated. First of many this year. And yeah, take care of yourselves. and I'll see you soon.